Daniel, thank you very much. Daniel Sanford there in Leigh-on-Sea. Now, the former Labour MP John Woodcock, now Lord Walney, is an independent advisor to the government on political violence and disruption, and he's been conducting a review due to be submitted by the end of the year. He joins us down in Walney. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. I know that when you originally appointed, you were kind of focusing on far-right violence, but the whole area of political violence is a big one, and obviously you were still an MP when Joe Cox was killed. I wonder if you think there are lessons that we thought we learned then that perhaps we hadn't learned in the light of what happened to David Amess yesterday.
Well, well put. I think there were two main areas, two big areas spring to mind and obviously this transported us right back to the time when Joe died and the shock of that, and this fresh shock with Sir David losing his life. I think on policing and security, I think Harriet Harman had a very strong point there, where there is surely a medium. No one, I think, is realistically talking about the kind of close protection for members of Parliament that the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister has. But in those days and weeks after Joe died, we certainly did review our security. We increased it in our offices in general, but many MPs wanted to keep the open surgeries in an open environment and being out visible members of the public. I was one of those, and I completely understand why people want to be that now. But I think while there was an increased level of communication with the police as to where we were having surgeries, there has not been, to my knowledge, a discreet police presence at most of those events. And I realise that is an issue that will increase levels of resource for the police, but surely it is something which ought to be on the table now and could be done in a discreet way, where conversations between constituents and MPs are still remaining in private, but there is, just as there will be a routine police presence at a whole range of things across any constituency in a given week. We're talking about, an hour a week, maybe less, maybe a bit more for some, but you're not talking about around-the-clock police presence for MPs, which I don't think is realistic, nor would anyone welcome.
Just to be clear what you're saying, you're clearly not talking about having a kind of a police officer looming over the constituent as they talk about their private matters. You're talking more about a kind of a visible presence, maybe somebody at the door, maybe somebody across the road, something that just reminds people that this is being watched, that it's not an isolated event.
No, yeah. So for example, in the weeks after Joe Cox died, and I was still an MP then, and we would give an increased level of information. The police wanted to know where the surgery was happening, and they would check it out, and it might be the local supermarket, local Morrison's. They'd go and they'd pop there at the beginning, pop there at the end. There's surely something that can be done in an increased way in that regard that can give look. There are no guarantees in this, and if there are, and the terror attacks over recent years have shown that if people are determined to commit a level of violence against individuals, including, of course, against a police officer with PC Palmer outside the Parliament gates, there can be no guarantees, but that might be a level of stepping up, which isn't happening at present, which may give an increased level of reassurance. But the second thing, I was going to say that there were two main things that came to mind, and if you don't mind, that I think the second big area is, after Jo died, her friends, many of her colleagues in Parliament, really pushed on what was one of her big ideas, which is that we have more in common in the main as parliamentarians, as politicians, as political activists from across different parties. We all, in general, want to do the best for people. We have different ways of doing it, and that we should look on our people in other parties as opponents, but not as enemies to be hated or denigrated or dehumanised in some respects. And I was reflecting on the 5th anniversary of her death recently that we felt a long way away from from that in a lots of the ways that people spoke. I mean, yes, there was a real problem, of course, on social media, and many of my colleagues, particularly female colleagues in the Commons, experienced that. But also there is a greater need, I think, for leadership across those of us in positions of responsibilities to think about how we talk about each other.
I'm interested you raise that, and this is a kind of a difficult area because people express themselves in different ways and with different degrees of passion. But I am therefore reminded of the situation only three or four so weeks ago when Angela Rayner was rebuked by some of her colleagues but stood her ground in her use of the word scum to describe Conservatives. Is that the sort of thing, and I know you're looking to kind of point the finger at individuals, but is that the sort of language that makes you uncomfortable and you think in some ways, not causes any event like it, it'd be daft to suggest that, but kind of poisons the atmosphere and kind of dehumanises the people who do politics?
Well, look, this is, you'll understand why I don't think this is a weekend for, particular links to be made, and there's many of us who are not going to want to be the ones to cast the first stone in this. There are many of us who have spoken. I can think, times that I've spoken about my opponents in both outside of the Labour Party or when I was in it and inside in ways that I think was probably unwise. But I really hope this is a moment. We thought this would have happened after Joe died, and to an extent it did, and the More in Common group achieved some great things, but there was still demonstrably a problem over in recent weeks and months, and one of the incidents you describe is of course an example of that, and we have to look at this now, because there are a myriad of different factors that can drive people towards political violence. But what I think often people have in common, despite your completely different ideological viewpoints, is that they have a sense of righteousness in their cause, that they think that it is overwhelmingly the right thing to do, and often it legitimises in their mind behaviour and acts, sometimes of acts of supreme tragic violence, but also a range of unacceptable behaviour below that, which they think the righteousness of the cause enables, and that is something that that I'm looking at as part of my review, and I think we do need to be much more rigorously challenging than perhaps we have done in recent years.
And that review will be presented to the Prime Minister before Christmas, you hope?
That's the plan, and we wait to see what happens to it after that. But my plan is to try to get it into the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary before Christmas.
One last thought, in a sense, I mean, the death of David Amess, the death of Joe Cox, the very serious injury experienced by Stephen Timms.
Yeah.
The death of Andrew Pennington and the, again, serious injuries that Nigel Jones, then MP, experienced back in 2000. These are at one end, the very extreme end of the kind of targeting of people who are in politics, whether they be local councillors, mayors, police and crime commissioners, MPs, MEPs, whatever they may be. Are you worried about a kind of not so much coarsening of language, but a kind of level of intimidation towards people who do politics that might actually inhibit them doing the job and perhaps on occasion speaking out and challenging things and challenging behaviours in their constituencies or nationally as a result?
Undoubtedly. I was listening to Joanna Cherry and Diane Abbott on the Radio 4 earlier on, people with whom, I mean, they will both know more than most, whom I've had profound disagreements with over the years, but they were both talking in really moving and alarming terms about the levels of abuse that they suffer. And Joanna in particular was saying that she wouldn't have got into politics had she known that this was going to happen, and that is at the extreme. There is the violence that does seem to have that has taken to David's life, and that seems to may well have been driven by a cause. That's extreme, but there is a spectrum of people being put off the political process or intimidated from speaking, intimidated from getting involved, which is is damaging, can really damage us as a Britain, as a liberal democracy. And we have to, I think, understand that as a spectrum, just as with violence against women and girls, sexual violence, where people have rightly spoken about a spectrum of behaviour and red flags and things that ought to have been tackled further down the track. Then I think we need to reconsider that within the framework of political discourse and how we relate to each other.
John Woodcock, Lord Walney, Government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. Thanks very much for your time. Good to speak to you again. Thank you.